Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about AI and alternative grading and how perhaps the prevalence and student use of AI might encourage people to consider perhaps using alternative grading structures. And just going back a little bit to Ken Bain, who has done quite a bit of work in terms of effective methods of teaching and learning. He had a book, a couple of books out there that were really popular a while back. One is what the best college teachers do, and also what the best college students do. And he suggests there are three types of learners. There are strategic learners, surface learners, and deep learners. And strategic learners focus on getting the highest grade they possibly can do and try to maximize their grade by doing the least amount of effort to get the highest grade possible, to minimize the effort and possibly the learning required to get a high grade in the course. Surface learners are those learners who just want to get by, the students who just want to get that C in the course or maybe a B in the class, depending on their goals, but they really are not all that interested in learning other than they want to learn enough so that they can pass the course so they don't have to take it again. And neither of those are the types of students that we kind of hope our students are. And neither of those are the types of students that college faculty generally were, at least not in most of the classes, or at least not in courses in our own disciplines. And he suggests that what we really should be striving for are deep learners, the learners who really want to explore the concepts in much more depth, who really want to understand the material and so on. And we get those learners, but not as often as we'd like, perhaps. And, I think most of our students probably, at least in intro courses, not as much in our upper level and senior level courses, we do get more deep learners, people who really do want to explore the concepts. But in gen ed courses in particular, we may not get that many people falling into that category. So AI and grades, and students have been conditioned since they were in kindergarten pretty well, at least from first grade on, that what matters is the grade they get in their courses. And AI tools provide a really convenient and easy way of receiving higher grades without much effort at all, other than typing in effective prompts. And it doesn't really take that long to develop that. And there's some great tools out there that'll make it harder to detect AI output and so forth. And we're seeing more and more of that, unfortunately, because AI can do a very large share of at least traditional assignments. And one of the things, of course, many people are working on is coming up with assignments that integrate AI so that students are learning how to use AI tools, but also learning how to use them effectively and applying critical thinking and analysis to that. And that's something we need to work on. But one of the problems here is this incentive structure that a lot of the assignments that are used in many courses are really easy to do with AI. And if students have been conditioned that all that matters is the grade they receive, we're in a little bit of trouble there. And there have been a lot of people talking about raising concerns for quite a while now about the impact of grades on student interest and motivation. That in general, what do you think? Are students motivated by, well, when students are faced with a traditional grading system, particularly the types of traditional grading structures that were used in many classes historically, where there were 2 or 3, maybe 4 high stakes assessments, was the focus necessarily on learning, or was it on just getting those higher grades? I mean, what do students tend to do in those types of classes? Well, jump in if you feel like it. If not, we'll continue on. And in general, the concern is that so many of our students have been conditioned to focus only on grades because that's what they've learned from past experience matters the most. And one of the ways in which this shows up is that particularly in those classes where people are taking high stakes exams and so forth, which in-class exams are less vulnerable to academic integrity issues or the use of AI. at least currently, until we get more classes that can provide immediate feedback from scanning a text, scanning text on a page. Students tend to do a lot of cramming. They tend to study intensively the night before exams. They do a lot of repeated rereading and cramming, and all those things have been shown to be ineffective. We talked about that in lots of past workshops. And one of the points that many of the advocates of alternative grading make is that feedback is essential to learning, that students should be able to try something, make mistakes, receive feedback, and improve their work from that. But that doesn't require grading. And we're going to talk here mostly about some ways of getting around that. And another thing that's worth noting, and this is something that Josh Eiler and others note fairly frequently, and that grades were not always used in college and university. Universities date back many centuries, but the 100-point grading grading system was only adopted in math and philosophy at Harvard in 1837, and Yale introduced the 4.0 scale in 1813. Although, of course, they used Latin names for each of it. They didn't use 4.0, 3.0, etc. That came later as people stopped learning Latin. In any case, we did a reading group here last year on David Clark and Robert Talbert's book on alternative grading, which was, what was the name of the book?
Alternative grading?
Yeah, well, the book on grading.
Not the AI one.
I can't think of it offhand. But in any case, they suggest in their book.
Was it Grading for Growth?
Grading for Growth, yeah. Yes. And of course, sorry. They suggest any good grading system should have 4 basic principles. And there are many ways of doing this. One is there should be clearly defined standards so that students know what they need to learn and how they're going to be assessed. They should be receiving helpful feedback, and that the marks that are assigned, whatever type of grades or feedback system you're using, should provide some indication to students of the progress they're making. And there should be the possibility of learning from mistakes, because mistakes are part of learning, and students have been trained that they're not, that they need to do well from the very beginning, and they don't recognize that it's really common to make mistakes when you're first learning things. And in fact, in our disciplines, we only learn new things by making mistakes and getting feedback on what's working, what's not working, and so forth. And we need to build this into our class structures a bit more effectively. And the other thing they suggest is keep it simple. Don't make your grading system overly complicated. And when we were reading Grading for Growth, we did see some examples of extremely complicated grading systems, which, while it might be something you could work out in a grade book or in a Brightspace or something similar, was not very easy necessarily for students to understand. And they provide a number of examples of that. So you want to keep the grading system fairly simple, but you want students to be able to try things, make mistakes, and learn from those mistakes. And if we can shift students' focus from grades to learning by emphasizing that they are developing skills in our classes, that there's something we're doing in the class that's going to have some value that can't be easily done by AI tools, for example. We might be able to help convince them that what we're teaching or what they're working on in the class, the skills they're acquiring, are going to have some value. And if we can convince them that they're learning something of value, there really is no reason why they shouldn't rely on AI tools to get those grades so they can get the degree. Keeping assessments or low stakes assessments where people can try things, and either at no cost or at very low cost with the opportunity for some revision, is really helpful. Providing students with regular feedback and repeated attempts at things, so that we don't want to judge students by what they come into the class knowing. We want to evaluate their progress by how much they are able to do by the end of the course. Otherwise, we're assessing them based on where they happen to have lived, the income of their families, the school districts they went to, and a whole host of other things that really have nothing to do with their actual skill acquisition. And one thing, which if you've been to some of our earlier workshops, has been mentioned probably 2/3 of the workshops this time, is using the tilt approach, which is the transparency and learning and teaching approach developed by Mary Ann Winklemas. And basically, what it suggests is that whenever you give students some activity to do, whenever you give them an assignment of any form, you write it up in a fairly structured way where you first describe the purpose of the activity, talk about what skills are developing and why that might be important and how that feeds into the overall objectives of the course, and connecting it to students' values is useful. Then you talk about the purpose, the task. You describe the task you're expecting them to do, and you do that in a way that makes sense to students, because we can't assume that students know what an annotated bibliography, for example, might be. That we want to put it in clear, plain language that students will understand, even if they don't have much of a background in the discipline. And then the final part is providing them with the criteria for evaluation. So letting them know exactly how they'll be evaluated, perhaps providing a rubric, or providing providing exemplars of high quality work that have been done in the past, which you can either create or have past students do this. So that's really useful. Another thing that's useful is connecting to the NACE competencies. And the NACE competencies are those written up, and a new version came out last year from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And basically that describes the types of skills that employers are expecting college graduates to develop. And if we can remind students that these are skills that potential employers might see as being important for them if they're going to be working for them, that might, again, help provide a little bit more intrinsic motivation to learning, so that students are seeing that what we're doing is just not forcing them to go through a series of arbitrary hoops, but we're in fact helping them develop the skills that are going to be useful for them in their later careers. Okay, so if you want to consider alternative grading approaches, one of the simplest ones is a mastery learning approach. And in that case, you just give students either a limited number of attempts to demonstrate learning, and you only keep the highest grade. Sometimes people will let students take a quiz 2 or 3 times, for example. And you can easily set that up in Brightspace if it's an automated quiz drawing from a bank of questions, for example, where students can keep doing it until they get the highest grade, or until they pass it, et cetera. And that way there's no penalty for making mistakes. Now, it's easier to do that in STEM fields where you can come up with algorithmic questions so that you can come up with the basic structure of the question. But if it's in other areas, for example, if you're working in writing, giving students unlimited numbers of attempts to write an essay or a poem or something could require quite a bit of effort on the part of instructors. And so, you may want to limit it to a couple of drafts or something similar. And that can work pretty well. And if you're in a discipline where adaptive learning platforms are available, such as Alex or any number of other platforms, that's already built in. And in fact, the nice thing about adaptive learning platforms is it will create a customized learning path that gives students who have stronger backgrounds in some areas fewer questions, and we'll spend less time on those areas the students have already developed skills in, and we'll shift the students' efforts to those areas where they're the most need for skill development, or where they can most benefit from that. So it allows people to move through a bit more efficiently. The only problem with mastery learning approaches, if you're doing them outside of class, which is how they're normally done, is that AI can complete pretty much any of the types of work that you are likely to have done. And those tools are becoming better and better. And I know a lot of people are relying on detection algorithms, but those detection algorithms are not great. The best one is Turnitin, and that at best tends to be about 95% accurate when you have over 500 words based on this. However, there's a lot of really good tools now that are being marketed to students that will rewrite things that are written by AI to make them seem a little bit less good. That will throw in some spelling errors, or will throw in some grammatical errors, or will break up the logical flow, or will reduce those words that AI tools are more likely to insert into the essays. In fact, there's some nice GPTs out there. We talked about that in another session that will rewrite student work to make it undetectable by AI tools. So, mastery learning is great if students already have the motivation to do this. And it's a good start. It's certainly better than just using high stakes exams. The benefits will let students focus on the areas where they need the most work, and it's already building in retrieval practice, which is one of those things that's really essential in building in long-term recall, as well as building in the ability to engage in transfer, taking concepts you've learned in one area and then applying them in a different or a new context. Retrieval practice is good at both of those things. Now, another approach, and this is actually one that was developed by Linda Nielsen about a decade and a half or so ago. And it's basically grading students on a pass-fail basis for individual activities, that you create assignments with very clearly specified requirements, the specs or the specifications for the assignment. And then again, you're using a pass-fail basis on that. They either met the specifications or they don't. So that way, you're not worrying about whether someone's grade is 57 or a 58 or an 87 or an 88 or an A minus or an A, et cetera. That basically you just say, did this assignment meet the specification or did it not? And what she suggests is that, well, let's go back a bit. What she suggests is the level for passing should be roughly B-level work, so that if they would have received a B on this in the past with traditional grading systems, that would be considered meeting the specifications. And what she suggests is that the course grade is determined by either the number of assignments you successfully completed, or by putting together different bundles of specifications for grades of A, B, and C, for example. So that, if you have, let's say, 15 sets of assignments in the class, if they pass the specifications on perhaps 12 of those or 13 of those, they get an A. If they meet the specifications on 12 of those, or let's say 10 to 12 of those, they get a B, however you want to do that. But basically, in this case, students are just striving to meet the specific requirements, and they're no longer trying to eke out that highest possible grade. They're just trying to master those things we want them to master, which should put a little bit more focus on their learning. And what she also suggests is that when you do this, you might want to consider allowing students to redo some of these, because otherwise they're in a bit of trouble. You might allow them to do each of them twice, or perhaps you give a certain number of redo attempts, tokens or something similar, which will allow them to redo things more. But the other way of doing it is you could set different, it's closer to contract grading in this form, but you could define A-level work as completing a specific set of specifications, a B-level grade if they complete a different set of specifications, where the students basically choose what grade they want and they work towards that. And you want to do it in a way so that if they find out they're not going to be able to get the A, that it would be possible to get a B, for example, by stepping down a little bit. But you could set higher standards. If you have students doing research projects, you could require a more complex research project. If you're doing programming projects, you might have more elaborate programming for A-level work than for B-level work, for example. And you can do, you might require more elaborate creative writing assignments or something more advanced, perhaps, to get an A than to get a B or a C. But again, all the assignments have clearly defined specifications, often expressed in a rubric, and again, she recommends providing students with samples of high quality work that have been used in the past. Does that make any questions on that?
John, you said Linda Nielsen? Is that the
Nielsen,
person who came
yes.
up with this?
Nilson, and she has a book called Specifications Grading. She's also someone who's on the AQ course, I think 3 or 4 times. She talks about a number of different things there. And we also have, I think, 3 or 4 podcasts with her. One of them is on specifically specifications grading. She's really good. She just retired, actually. She was the director of the teaching center at Vanderbilt and Drexel. Vanderbilt, I think, before Derek Bruff, and at Drexel for a very long time until she retired. I think it was Drexel. Well, in any case, right now she is taking care of animals in an animal shelter and really enjoying that.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been thinking about exploring specs grading for quite a while. So I'm definitely interested in this one.
So, any other comments on specs grading? Okay, 2 other approaches are contract grading and labor-based grading, and they're somewhat related. With contract grading, students agree to a contract in which each grade is tied to a specific set of criteria, which might include things like allowed absences in the course, the number of drafts, papers, and assignments completed in a satisfactory manner, and the number of reading responses, for example. And one argument here is that students are being graded just based on doing these things, not necessarily how well they do them, but it's based on the amount of effort they put in. This is actually fairly common in a lot of basic writing classes and so forth, where students might, and many people who are teaching writing have moved to contract grading or labor-based grading. And so basically students are based on how much effort they put in, which is not how in most disciplines this is done, but it is something where students are practicing and they're developing skills. And, in a lot of occupations, it's not uncommon for people to require some type of an internship or residency where they just practice doing things. And in general, with contract grading, there is some minimum level of acceptable work and so forth. But basically, it's taking some of the pressure off of students in terms of trying to get that highest grade. They just know if they complete this number of assignments acceptably, they're going to get whatever grade is specified. Contract grading is basically the contract. Labor-based grading is one part of contract grading, which is often used, where it's based essentially just on these number of easily observed and easily verified activities. And one complaint about this in terms of allowed absences is that might be a bit unfair or unequitable for students who may have health issues or may have, from people who are commuting and may have older cars that may break down, or who may be taking care of sick family members and so forth. But it can always be done in a way where there are exceptions provided by that, but it's better if this is done across the board so that everyone is given equal treatment regardless of their individual circumstances. But in any case, this tends to be done much more in humanities classes than in STEM fields and so forth. So
can I ask a question about this, John?
Sure.
So like my understanding of like contract grading then is really it's like sort of like graded based on completion versus like specs grading, yes, which is graded based on whether or not you met whatever the requirements are for that yes, specific assignment.
Yes.
Okay, so this is just another way to say it's graded based on completion.
It's completion grading, typically. Okay. Yeah, okay. But it's completion, but then there's generally a minimum standard. If someone is asked to write an essay and they turn in 2 or 3 sentences, that generally would not meet that. So their specifications is generally aimed towards a higher specific standard set of requirements. with contract grading, this is often combined with some minimum threshold. That, for example, if there's a number of allowed absences, but the student is always falling asleep in the class or is spending the whole time chatting with people next to them, that might not meet that number of, things. But those are things that would be negotiated. And often what happens is the contracts are individually negotiated between faculty and the students in terms of what mix of things can be done. It provides more flexibility in that way. Other times it's just a pure across the board contract, which is offered to everybody. And often, though, this type of thing is combined with some form of ungrading, and we'll get to that next. But does that make some sense? It is mostly based on completion, but often completion of at least some minimum quality. So you can't just turn in complete junk. There has to be some minimum standard that you're meeting. But it's not graded according to a specific well-defined set of standards. And it does provide a bit more flexibility if you're doing more creative projects, for example.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That makes sense.
Okay. And the next approach, and this is what more and more people have been advocating for, and we've seen a number of books on that. Josh Eiler's new book focuses to a larger extent on ungrading. And Josh Eiler actually uses a mix between contract grading and an ungrading approach, because he sets some minimum standards that students have to meet in order to get a grade of C or better. If they don't do a bare minimum of work, they're going to end up failing the course or getting a D in the course and so on. But ungrading is a bit more flexible because it does define, well, let's talk about it. What happens is to completely shift the focus away from grades, that students never receive a grade on their course, except perhaps during midterms or when final grades are received, because the institutions require us to submit grades, but students are not getting grades anywhere along the way directly. What happens is the focus is shifted entirely to skill development and to feedback. And you specify clear learning objectives for the class and for any assignments that students complete. And students engage in self-reflection. So it's designed often with having reflective journals or blogs where students are writing about their learning journey. They're talking about what they learned. They're talking about new applications they've made. They're talking about how the skills are developing and so forth. And these journals sometimes are shared only with the instructor. Sometimes, this is true in a number of English classes, for example, or writing classes, students will create a blog and share that either with the class or perhaps publicly when they're acquiring new skills. And this is also done a lot with internship programs or with study abroad programs, where students will keep a blog or at least a reflective journal talking about what they're learning at each stage of the course or the progress. And then instructors are regularly providing students with feedback on the work and suggestions for improvements and so forth. But again, it's not less work for the instructors because you're providing students with feedback and trying to get all students to continually develop and improve in their skills, and giving them feedback. And one of the justifications for this is that there have been a lot of studies about how when students receive feedback and a grade, they focus almost entirely on the grade and they use as little feedback as they're required to do. If you require students to resubmit something based on feedback, they will do that. They won't always embody that feedback very well, but for the most part, feedback tends to be ignored if it's accompanied by a grade. If they did well, they generally are just pleased and they don't continue to develop their skills. If they did poorly, they tend to get discouraged and sometimes will give up and disappear, as we often see. So the goal here is to help all students, regardless of where they're starting with, develop as much as possible by giving them feedback that allows them to continue to improve their skills. And doing that in a way which is motivating. And one of the things in the reading group we did this spring, one thing that's useful is wise feedback, where what you tell students, although it may not quite fit into this grading approach quite as much, but with a wise feedback approach, you say you have very high standards for their work. and you know that they're capable of meeting those standards. And by doing that, the research shows that people are much more likely, or students are much more likely to learn from that feedback and are more likely to implement that feedback. And there are midterm and final grades, certainly final grades, because those are always required. Midterm grades are put in if the institution requires them. But the way it works basically is the students suggest a grade to their instructors, and then there's a one-on-one consultation between the student and the instructor. And the way this is normally done is that instructors provide some type of a survey form. Here, we'd probably use Google Forms. You could also use Qualtrics, or if you're, at a Teams campus, you might use one of the crappy Microsoft forms for the same thing, where basically you're giving students the same rubric you told them at the beginning, that these are the skills they were supposed to be meeting and developing. And you ask them to reflect on what level they feel they've achieved those things. And then they suggest a grade based on what they perceive as the amount of learning that occurred in the class after having been reflecting on that learning and engaging in a sort of metacognitive activity throughout the semester. And then the instructor and students meet to discuss this and mutually agree to a grade. And, the two main concerns that come up is, one is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where some people may think they're just, the greatest student to ever have achieved anything in a class. They may have a really great mind, for example, or they may, they may know more than all the generals. Oh, no, that's something different. But the Dunning-Kruger effect is that, was shown by Dunning and Kruger, grad student and the professor, who found that the students who knew the least about a subject tended to overestimate their knowledge the most, as we see in our president on a daily basis, for example. So there's concern that perhaps the people who really don't understand things as well may feel that they've accomplished more than they have. The other possibility, though, is a concern about stereotype threat, where students who come from groups that have historically been marginalized in the discipline may tend to underestimate their ability and so forth. And people who use ungrading have claimed that in general, maybe 1 out of 30 students or 1 out of 40 students might overestimate their grade, but it's rare. And generally, they say that pretty much universally, when they say that they've done this, that there's always 1 or 2 students in the class who might say they really deserved an A, but then you remind them that they didn't turn in all their assignments, or they got some feedback that they didn't build on. And pretty much always, from the people I've talked to about this anyway, when they've done this, the students have generally backed down, and they were trying to scam one, over perhaps, but they recognize that really they didn't quite meet all those criteria, and generally they come to agreement pretty quickly. What they generally state, though, is it's much more common for historically minoritized groups, for female students and so forth, to underestimate the amount of learning that the instructor perceives has been done. And generally, the conversation is done to help overcome some of that stereotype threat and remind them of the progress that they've made in that course. So that's, again, a practice which people who've done this have generally stuck with it and have generally been really happy with their progress and with the use of this technique. And we've had a few people on campus use it. I know Maggie has used it in a few of her classes, Maggie Smool, who is on sabbatical this year. And have you done anything with ungrading?
Not yet. I was going to do it with my internship.
But it's worth considering. It doesn't scale very well. If you have a class of 200 to 400 students, just scheduling the meetings would be a somewhat complex process, or reviewing individual weekly reflections with a few hundred students might be a bit of a challenge. But in smaller classes, this is a really effective way of shifting your focus away from grades. And if students are focusing on maximizing their learning rather than getting the highest grade, there's really no reason for them to consider using AI as a substitute for learning. You can still build AI use into this. We'd be doing our students a disservice if we don't teach them how to use AI effectively and, critically. But if a task is one where we want them to do something on their own without that, we can build it in. And as long as they know they're just going to be getting feedback and they're going to be evaluated based on their progress in learning the material, and their own reflections on that, it really takes away a lot of the incentives to engage in academic integrity violations. And people, again, everyone I've talked to who've done this really tends to rave about it. It's still a relatively small cult, but it's a growing cult. So it's worth considering.
John, is there anything about, if an ungrading approach tends to be more effective with like freshmen versus upperclassmen? Like, I've been thinking about trying this for several years now, but because I teach mostly freshmen, I really get nervous about attempting it because they come in from high school like so grade focused. And I mean, like, I feel like I
Yeah.
could like try to talk to them about it all I want, but they're just not going to listen to me at the end of the day. And they're going to be more stressed about no grade versus like actually kind of doing this the way that I would want them to.
Yes, and both in the book Grading for Growth and a little bit, but also more extensively in Sarah Rose Kavanaugh's most recent book, which was
The Mind Over Monsters.
Mind Over Monsters. She actually talks a little bit of, I should be careful here, but I'm pretty sure it's in this book. It might have also been a conversation we had on a podcast or a conversation I had while driving her to the airport. But one of the things she talked about, in any case, and I believe it is in her book, was that she tried ungrading both in a freshman level class and in a senior level course, and it worked far better in the senior level course. And in large part, it was for the reasons you talked about, that students who come in as freshmen have been really focused on grades entirely up to that point, and our whole system of the No Child Left Behind Act and so on certainly encourages more of a focus on tests and test mastery because school district funding and teacher salaries and jobs depend on test scores. So that is conveyed to students pretty regularly. And it's harder to break that from freshmen. And also, they haven't necessarily developed the same sort of reflection skills that we're hoping they develop as they move through college. So, in general, that's an issue. And one other concern that she mentioned specifically herself was that she was having a conversation with her daughter, and this is in the book, where her daughter was studying a class where it wasn't quite ungraded, but it was close to that. But what she was doing is she was focusing her efforts on the things she really, really enjoyed. And she wasn't really putting in much of the time on the things that in that specific course was really essential, but was not as much fun or not quite as interesting and engaging. And because the ungrading approach is basically tied to building more engagement, you do have to help motivate some of the grunt work in the disciplines, that some of the skills you acquire may not be as intrinsically motivating as some of the other skills or some of the applications of those skills. So it is important that you make clear to students that some of these tasks may be tedious as part of your learning, but it is essential if you're going to become expert in this area, or if you're going to develop the skills you need to effectively work in this area. So yes, it generally has, well, I say that at least in those two cases, was suggested it worked better in upper level classes than in a freshman class. On the other hand, Josh Eiler uses ungrading in a freshman writing class, and he's done that for a number of years now, and he's claimed it's worked really effectively. But they're smaller classes, and he can work, individually, perhaps more easily with students than, if it was a larger intro class. And what he does again is he combines ungrading with a bit of contract grading, where there's a minimum standard you have to meet in order to get a grade above a C. But after that, it's negotiated based on the student's reflections on their learning journey. And, you know, when you get those reflections from students, you can also give them feedback saying, yes, this is progress, but you may need to also focus a little bit on these skills if you're going to progress to the next stage or something. So giving students feedback is much more helpful if there are no grades tied to it. So, and I think, is that the last? Okay, here's a link to some other resources. And oh, let me share I'll put the slides in the chat. Or if you scan, well, actually, if you scan that image on the previous screen, let me just go back to that for a second, so I don't, oh, come on. There we go. Let me go back to the screen for a second. You can get this by either typing in the URL on the left or by scanning that QR code, this dragonless QR code. So this was done before I was using Google for this. Okay, so now if we go over here, here's some general information about this. Josh Eiler's new book came out last summer on Failing Our Future. Here's a grading for growth book we referred to. This was a website created by a SUNY Faculty Task Group on innovative assessments, which provided a 4-part webinar series. And there's a link there to all the webinars on a variety of topics associated with this. Oh, and this was a podcast with David Clark and Robert Talbert, and here's the book link, and the same thing here. Here was an overview of mastery learning from an Edge to Surge podcast. Here's Linda Nielsen's book and a podcast we did with her a while back. Here's some other work related to contract and labor-based grading. And here's some podcasts and blog posts and other things on ungrading. If you're really interested in doing this, in the show notes for this episode with Emily Pitts-Donahue, there's a link to her blog, and her blog focuses on her ungrading journey. So you can see how her ungrading work has progressed as she moves through. And I'm getting a spam risk phone call. Okay. And some other resources. A classic piece on ungrading was Jesse Stommel's article on this, and various, well, here's some other podcasts we did related to this. And here are the blogs. The Unmaking the Grade by Emily Pitts-Donahue is really good. Here's a Grading for Growth Substack, which comes out weekly. And here's one that we all wrote on it. And another one that Josh Eiler has in terms of alternative grading systems, which is it doesn't have to be this way in terms of grading primarily. Okay, so any questions, thoughts, or comments? I'll stop the screen share now that I'm sharing the right screen. Any thoughts or comments or questions or suggestions?
No, I mean, I found everything really helpful. I think I'm leaning more towards specifications grading first. And I think Rebecca did this at one point, didn't she, John?
Rebecca did, and I think she tried ungrading, but no, she tried specs grading, and
yeah.
I think she thought it worked. She had mixed results on it, from what I remember. That it worked well for some students, but for some students, it was a little hard for them to adjust to it, from what I recall.
Yeah, that sounds right. That's what my memory is also, but I think I'm going to chat with her more about that. I think of these, that's the one I'm going to lean toward first, and maybe even attempt it for the summer program, and kind of see how that would work.
And what I'd really love to see is a panel at some point of people trying alternative grading systems and talking about how it has worked. So if you do that, that would be a really good winter breakout workshop if we can get a few people doing it.
Yeah, I mean, the summer program students too are kind of an interesting group because they're literally fresh out of high school. But I'm trying to think about, ways to like navigate the AI thing, but also, kind of show them like, here, this is what you need to have done, right? And these things are the most, and kind of building in that critical thinking piece, right? Like even like deconstructing an assignment itself and saying like, what's the minimum you need to do, and kind of teaching them how to read an assignment, and understand it. So we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be good. And let us know.
Yeah, this was super helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Okay, we'll stop the recording and